You're listening to the NFPT podcast, where we help aspiring trainers pass their exams and launch their fitness careers. Welcome back to the NFPT podcast, where all episodes are designed around making you a successful certified personal trainer, starting with passing your CPT exam. And today we're going to be talking about squat movement patterns. I'm your host, Erin Mahoney, General Manager of NFPT and also still an active certified personal trainer. Let's get started. So, in talking about movement patterns for the squat motion, this is why it's important for test coverage. First of all, we know that human anatomy is a decent sized chunk of questions on your exam. So, when you know the movement patterns during a squat motion, you are also learning the muscles and the bones and the joints involved with each motion. You're also learning the muscle synergies. So you're able to identify which muscle is responsible for what during a squat motion. Now, that information then builds on to the next part that you need to know, which is fitness assessments. So, a squat assessment or an overhead squat assessment is a really great assessment to do with clients. And you can't perform it correctly or translate it correctly if you don't know what the movement patterns are for a squat, an ideal movement pattern. And when you do that fitness assessment, then we also know that is going to lead into program design so that based on your findings with that client, you're able to design a safe and effective program so that they can get the most out of their workouts. And then while you're training them, making sure that you know the correct exercise technique during a squat motion. All right, what we're covering today for squats is going to include the joint motions. So we'll talk about the 3 different joint motions happening during a squat. We'll talk about the muscle synergies. So, what is responsible for what? And then we'll explore the different movement compensations that you might see during an overhead squat assessment. And then lastly, we'll talk about different ways you can change up this motion to modify the workout, either by progressing it or regressing it, depending on the client's needs. Movement patterns are one of our 4 most critical topics in passing the CPT exam. And so this is called the NFPT Core 4 Learning Model, and it includes muscle fibers, energy systems, biomechanic principles, and movement patterns. When you know each of these 4 main topics, you're able to nail 80% of what's on that final exam. All right, let's dive into these squat joint motions. First of all, we've got the hip. And during a squat, when you are going from that squatting position to a standing position, you are moving into hip extension. So the upper leg is moving towards the back of the body. And then at the knee, you're going into knee extension, from knee flexion to knee extension. And then lastly, we have the foot and ankle complex. And so as you're squatting down, the shins or the tibia and fibula have to migrate forward a little bit. And that allows the body to maintain its center of gravity. And so as the shins or the tibia tracks forward, it is performing what's called dorsiflexion. That is a joint motion. Now, here's a little tip for you as we move into understanding the muscle synergies during a squat. Make sure when you are answering any of these questions that you're paying attention to what joint it is asking for, right? Because the question might say, hey, what is the agonist during a squat? And you might think right away it's the quads, but you need to make sure that it's asking for the agonist at the knee versus the hip, because otherwise you'd have 2 totally different answers. All right, so let's take a look at these muscle synergies. At the hip, you have first your agonist, that's your prime mover, and you have your glute maximus. That's responsible for the majority of the work. It's a big muscle, it performs hip extension, and that is the prime mover at the hip during a squat motion. Then you've got your antagonist. So these are the muscles that oppose the agonist, and they're lengthening out during the concentric phase of the motion. So in this instance, we have our hip flexors, right? Because if our glute max is a hip extender and it's the agonist or prime mover, then the opposite muscle is going to be the antagonist. So that includes our hip flexors, our psoas muscle, and our TFL, which is short for tensor fascia latae. Then we've got our synergists. So A synergist is a smaller muscle and it is supposed to help out the prime mover or the agonist. So, again, it's smaller, it's just there to help out. And at the hip during a squat, that's the piriformis. It's a very deep glute muscle and it's smaller and it tends to get overactive on people when a glute max is underactive. The piriformis starts taking up the majority of the work and it wasn't meant to do that. So clients might experience some deep glute pain when this happens. And then we've got our stabilizer muscles. So these are the muscles that are helping prevent unwanted motion during a squat. And those include the adductors, the glute medius, the transverse abdominis of the core, and the erector spinae. So all of that is happening at the hip. Then we've got our knee. So at the knee, the agonist, because again, it's different than at the hip, the prime mover at the knee during a squat is the quadriceps, because these are the muscles, or this is the muscle group that is performing hip extension, or sorry, knee extension, which is happening when we're going from that squatting position to standing. And then the antagonist, the muscle that opposes the quadriceps, is our hamstring muscles. All right, let's move on to some movement compensations that you'll see during a squat, very specifically during a fitness assessment. The first thing that you might see during a squat is that the knees might cave in or they might be migrating forward in towards the midline of the body. And that would be an indication that the client has overactive adductors. So remember, when you're identifying overactive muscles, the body moves in the direction of those overactive muscles. So in this case, if the knees are moving inward, we know we've probably got some overactive adductors or inner thighs. And then on the opposite side, we've got an underactive glute medius, because that glute medius is supposed to be performing hip abduction. And that is why it would be considered underactive in this instance. Then we have a trunk forward lean, or sometimes known as an excessive forward lean. So when your client is doing a squat, and if you're looking at them from the side or a lateral view, their torso or their trunk should be remaining parallel with their lower leg or their shins. And so they've got a bit of a forward lean, but when it goes greater than parallel to the lower leg, then that's what we consider a trunk forward lean or an excessive forward lean. And what could be happening in that instance is we could have overactive calves, specifically our gastrocnemius and the soleus. And what's happening there is that motion that should be happening at the foot and ankle complex, the dorsiflexion, it's not happening. The calves are preventing it from the tibia to be migrating forward. So those calves are too overactive. And if that's the case, then the underactive muscles, when we're talking about this, are going to be the anterior tibialis, or it's going to be the anterior tibialis. You also might see the lower back arching during a squat assessment. And typically you'll see this, especially if their arms are up, but even if their arms are down by their side or on their hips, the back might start arching. And what that could be indicating is that we've got overactive hip flexors, because again, those same hip flexors are pulling the top of the hips forward, which then is going to lead to an overactive erector spinae. So this is the muscle group that runs along your spine and is responsible for spinal extension. So the overactive muscles in the back arching would be the hip flexors and the erector spinae, while the underactive muscles would be the glute max and the core. Now, when you are performing squat motions with your clients, you want to make sure that they have a neutral hip. So you don't want them to have a rounded lower back or an arched lower back, but right in between. And then you want also their weight to be evenly distributed between both feet. So you don't want them, a lot of times people are instructing their clients to put their weight back in their heels, but really they want an even weight distribution throughout their feet. And you want their eyes to be gazed forward. So as they squat down, their eye movement has to change. If they continue to be spotting or staring at one spot on the wall, let's say, then their head is going to have to lift up as they squat down. So instead, what they're looking at is going to change as they squat down. And as they do their squatting motion, you want to make sure that their core is engaged and activated because it is a stabilizer. And they should be performing the motion with a controlled range of motion. So they really shouldn't be going farther into the range of motion than they're able to perform without any movement compensations. Now, let's take a look at some different ways that you can be performing squats with clients. So, first of all, and we'll start in more of a regressed modification, you can be doing single leg squats. This is great for developing balance, and it's also for helping out those stabilizer muscles, so the glute medius and the adductors. You can also do chair sits, where the client just sits down to the height of a chair and then stands back up. They can do it with both legs or one leg, but the point here is to really nail their form and make sure that they are decelerating slowly. So they're not just dropping down into that chair, but instead they are controlling that motion literally the entire way down and then standing up. You can also do a squat to balance. So, this is where you would have the client squat down, and as they stand up, they would shift all of their weight to one foot, bringing the other knee up and balancing until they can hold that balance, and then they would go back down. Now, if we're looking to increase the intensity or progress the client with a squat motion, they could be doing a drop squat. So, this is where they would slow the motion down on the way down on the descent into the squat, maybe a 2 or a 3 count, and then they would pop it up quick into a 1 count. And so they could either stand up on their toes, moving into plantar flexion, or they could jump with their feet together and then repeating the motion. You could also have your client do turning squat jumps or horizontal squat jumps. That allows them to move in more than one plane of motion. And you could also have them do explosive plyometric activities like tuck jumps or multiplanar box jumps. So, a bit more on squat movement patterns. Remember, you need to know this in order to pass your CPT exam. And specifically, when it comes to squats, what you're going to want to focus on are the muscle synergies. So remember what we talked about for the prime mover and the muscle that is opposing the prime mover. And then also, you really want to make sure that you can nail those movement assessments. So if you're given a question where you are observing a movement impairment, be able to identify what the overactive muscles might be, the underactive muscles, and what potential exercise you could do in order to reverse that movement impairment. So, as we think about the NFPT Core 4 learning model, we want to make sure that you know these foundational concepts. And then you should be practicing them. So, what you can do is you can practice with the movement impairment in order to get a better understanding of what might be happening when you feel it. And then you're going to gain confidence with test questions and in application and clients. And that's it for today's episode on movement patterns involved in a squat. Remember, NFPT is here, so we remove the barriers to your success. Enroll in your NFPT CPT today, or check out our recorded exam prep series, which supplements any CPT package. Thanks for joining. Keep moving and be well. Today's episode is brought to you by Summit Professional Education. Unlock your potential with Summit Professional Education, your trusted partner for expert-led courses, flexible learning, and essential CEUs. Elevate your skills today at summiteducation.com.